Hi, everyone. This is Sean Kim from Ice Miller, joining from Seoul. It's Tim Huang. It's good to be here. Nice to join you guys in New York. This is 8 a.m. in South Korea, and surprisingly, we had over 15 guests here in person, everyone wearing masks and observing COVID precautions. But it's good to be here to join you guys, and I just want to thank Kotra and Korea Society for inviting us and having us hosting us. So we have an exciting topic to discuss this morning or this evening in New York. We're going to talk about leveraging big data, artificial intelligence, and patents for business growth with someone who's actually been there, done that, and is still doing that with Tim. So we're excited to be here. So let's just dive in. Tim, for people who may not know about you or FiscalNote, maybe you could share a little bit about your journey to finding FiscalNote and how you came to find FiscalNote.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's great to be here, I guess, with everyone in multiple different formats.
Yeah.
So just a little bit about myself and my background. I started off my career actually not in technology or business, but actually in politics, as you know. Sean and I actually very different sides of the political spectrum. But I started off my career in 2007. Actually, my first job was working for President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, which is actually more of a win than anything else. And then ended up surprisingly doing pretty well in 2008, and enjoyed kind of working on the political side of the house. In 2009, I had the interesting opportunity to run for office. So I ended up running for the Board of Education in the state of Maryland. Fortunately or unfortunately, I got elected at the age of 17. Served there for one term, and very, very interesting job, essentially running the education department, in Maryland. Having gone down the political field for a couple of years, I decided to take a little bit of a break. I was 18 at the time. My parents essentially told me to go back to college, and so ended up going to Princeton, studying politics, public policy, computer science. And then was actually about to start my MBA over at Harvard, and actually dropped out to start this company. And this company, what I wanted to do was essentially build at the intersection of technology and politics, kind of the two fields that I had a lot of interest in. And one of the things that you have a lot of appreciation for when you are sitting in government is how inefficient government is. And a lot of times, the work that you're doing, spending time in government, is actually following what other people in government are actually working on, right? So if you're sitting in Congress, you're trying to follow what the regulatory agencies are doing. If you're sitting in the White House, you're trying to follow what Congress is doing. If you're sitting in the State Department and the Foreign Ministry, you're trying to follow what other governments are doing. And so you realize that the majority of time, maybe not a majority, but a lot of the time that you spend in government is just tracking everything else that everybody else is doing. So we decided to go out 2013 to build a technology company in Silicon Valley. So we moved out to Silicon Valley. We grabbed a couple friends. We bootstrapped a couple $1,000s. And we decided to build a business going straight after the legal information market. So this is the market that was dominated by LexisNexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg, Wolters Kluwer, and a couple other players. And we wanted to essentially build an AI-driven solution that collected legislation, statutes, regulations, court cases, government filings, government documents from as many countries as possible, and then used natural language processing, text processing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, computer vision to essentially start building some very novel applications for collecting legal information and then analyzing that legal information for our customers. The company was founded in summer of 2013. This was actually right as I was leaving undergraduate. And then, really it took off from there. I mean, it's been about 7 years now, I guess. And, we definitely have grown quite a bit. We now service about 5,000 customers and law firms and companies. So our biggest customers are U.S. Army, U.S. military, CIA, NSA, CDC, SEC, FDA. We have big corporate clients as well. I would say about half the Fortune 500 are our customers today in their general counsel offices. And then pretty much a large portion, I would say almost 2/3 of the AmLaw 100 are our customers today. And so we've been able to obviously build a very interesting business, basically helping lawyers of all shapes and sizes across the corporate, government, and civil society and law firm segments, essentially helping them understand the laws and regulations that are relevant for their clients and for their businesses.
Right. That's amazing growth. And I still remember when we last met in 2015, you're still commuting from New York to DC almost every week. And I was pleasantly surprised to find you still do that.
Yeah, well, DC has the highest concentration of lawyers in America. And so we had to move our company from Silicon Valley to DC headquarters. But obviously New York is the second largest, so we've been going back and forth for a while.
Right. So thank you so much for giving us an overview of how you grew FiscalNote. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, now that you achieved where you are, you also ventured into some of the media space and with the acquisition of Roll Call. And maybe you could talk about how that process went and some of the acquisition strategies that are now driving the growth behind FiscalNote.
Yeah, so in 2018, we conducted a transaction with The Economist Group and effectively carved out some of the core government assets within The Economist. So we paid about $180 million to acquire some of the core American media assets, namely Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call. For those of you who don't know, Congressional Quarterly is probably the database of record for Washington, D.C. It's sort of like the Bloomberg for D.C., basically following legislation out of Congress. They've got direct data feeds into the congressional basement, physical wires that go into the congressional basement that pull in things like transcripts off committee hearings, amendments off of congressional markups, budget and appropriations. And then we acquired a consumer media property called Roll Call, which has actually, it's been around since about 1945, basically following political updates in Washington from right after World War II. So our business, I would see it as we are primarily an information business. So we sell information to our customers. And very similar to the way in which Bloomberg sells stock data and bond data and foreign exchange data, we sell legal data to organizations. So the first thing to do, in terms of our acquisition strategy, whether it's CQ or other acquisitions, is we are looking for businesses that have unique legal data sets that we can essentially incorporate into our technology platform. So it could be a Japanese court case product. It could be a regulatory data business out of Australia. It could be a statutory business out of Nigeria. But we're essentially pulling in multiple different data sets from around the world. The second thing is we are building our media business quite extensively. So very similar to the way in which Dow Jones has the Wall Street Journal, Thomson has Reuters, Bloomberg has Bloomberg News. We are building FiscalNote and then our news division. And in our news division, we're right now at the moment focused primarily on news, right? So political news. So what's happening in Congress, what's happening in Brussels, what's happening in Beijing, what's happening in Singapore, what's happening in all these different centers of power, and how do they impact global policy, global trade policy, global customs, tariffs. And then secondarily, we are increasingly moving into what I call secondary hard content. So outside of political content, business and economic content, and then eventually entertainment as well. So we are increasingly kind of building out that media function within our business.
Sure. So for those of you who may not know about the core offering part of the FiscalNote, namely the GRM, the Government Relationship Management system, how that works. Can you just describe about your core product and how that grew over time using artificial intelligence and big data?
Yeah, so our core business, I would divide it into kind of two categories. So number one is the data and content, and number two is the workflow software. So the data and content is primary legal documentation, right? So when lawyers look up statutes, when they look up case law, when they look up regulations, we're essentially pulling all these different documents from tens of thousands of government agencies around the world, and then we're using text processing to summarize it, structure it, classify it by industry, make it searchable, accessible, basically a legal search engine that people use on an ongoing basis, on a global basis. We pair that additionally with proprietary news and analysis and research that helps attorneys effectively navigate the practical aspects of law. So the regulatory aspects, the case law aspects, we expect this and this to be overturned as a result of the political dynamics in this particular circuit. So basically those types of analysis. And then that analysis and research gets fed into a workflow software product. Getting alerts, notifications, dashboards, reporting capabilities. We have a software module, for instance, that enables companies to log all of their interactions with regulators. So if you are a pharmaceutical company, you can actually use the software to have all of your people across the firm log every single time in a core CRM. Every time they get a call from the FDA, or every time they have to have a conversation with a drug regulator in any part of the world, you can have a centralized repository of all your regulatory filings and your interactions. So that's the sort of enterprise software capability part of our products that we built for the global Fortune 500 and then for large companies as well.
Right. And how does your AI algorithm work in layman's terms? So if you were to describe someone who doesn't know anything about artificial intelligence, how the natural language processing works, how would you describe that to a new client that you're trying to talk to about use of your product?
So our business is actually very similar to the oil business or a metals and mining business. So we're actually almost exactly the same. So our core business, we essentially have to build what we call an extraction engine. So instead of drilling in the ground for some raw resource, we partner with governments. We go into the internet. We go into government databases, and they essentially extract all of these raw resources, right? So in our case, it's billions and billions and billions of pages of text, so raw text. So that data is extremely valuable for us because we're essentially mining that. So the next portion is what I'll call cleansing. So we have to essentially clean that raw resource. So very similar to petroleum or to gold or to diamonds, we essentially have to take that raw resource. We have to clean it, we have to refine it, we have to process it. So in our case, we have to start putting metadata on top of it. So things like, this impacts this industry, it's from this regulatory agency, it impacts this particular set of companies. And then we have to send it into what we call our data pipeline. So our pipeline essentially is in the process of, it takes that refined data and it transforms it into something that's actually usable for web applications or for APIs or whatever the case is. So we essentially have to, we call it the ETL pipeline, right? Basically transforming that data to be able to make it available. And then once it's refined and once it's sent it to the pipeline, we have to make it usable for our customers, right? So if you're in the petroleum business, for instance, then it means that you have to take the gas and you have to put it in the ground and you have to let people pump it into their cars. Right. In our case, we have to build APIs, web applications, mobile applications where people can actually use that data, right? So they can actually search it, get alerts, they can basically pull that information out, generate reports. So our business is fundamentally an extraction business, a processing business, a transformation business, and then a delivery business. And all of the sort of AI, traditional AI that people talk about is in the middle of that, that layer, right? So the processing, the summarization, the classification of that text is actually done on an automated basis.
Mhm.
And so that's all powered by artificial intelligence in our organization.
I see. So stepping back a little bit, it's very impressive that you're able to grow the company so large and you're on a tear with acquisitions and growth. But I'm sure that you've had your share of challenges on the way, from your first capital raise, which is a very interesting story of yourself, to where you got now. Can you talk about how you grew along the way in terms of your first capital raise to now, and some of the challenges you face as an entrepreneur?
So this is my first company. I started this company when I was very young, when I was 21 years old essentially.
And you're 20.
I'm 28 now.
now,
Yeah, not by Korean age,
Yeah,
but 28 in the US.
so-
But by 20,
Way to make all of us feel underachieved.
but yeah, so I don't come from a particularly wealthy background, family background, or anything, and so we really had to struggle to get this company started. We essentially took our summer savings, internship money,
Right.
pulled it into a joint bank account with my co-founders. Is probably less than $5,000 or $6,000 that we all pulled together, and then when we were living in Silicon Valley, we couldn't afford an apartment, right? Because as many of you know, in the Valley, it's just extremely expensive. And so I think an apartment in Silicon Valley back then in 2013 was something like $3,000 or $4,000 a month to house us. We had something like $5,000 or $6,000 in our bank account. So what we had to do is we essentially were living out of a Motel 6 room, and this was we're paying something like $60 a night. 2 beds. Up until our 5th employee, basically, 2 guys sleeping on each bed, 1 guy sleeping on the floor, and that was our office. And we'd get up every morning. Probably, we were still young back then, so we'd get up like 9 or 10.
Yeah.
We would pick up the phone and start calling customers. Calling customers from 9 a.m. to about midnight, every single day, 7 days a week, for several months straight, and built the software, got our first customers. And started building the company. And I'd say about 6 months into the business, we started the process for raising capital. So first round of capital actually was led by Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. And basically what we did with Mark, actually, I think we got very lucky because we were watching Shark Tank one night, and I went on Google and I Googled Mark Cuban's email, and it was literally mark@axs.tv. You can still email him today. And then he responded within 45 minutes. I pitched him our idea. He responded and he said, I'll write the first check. He wrote the first $740,000 investment into the company. And then from there, a bunch of top tier Silicon Valley venture funds started investing. Right? So NEA, first round, Jerry Yang, the founder of Yahoo, and ended up raising about 1.3 million in that first seed round. I think at this stage we probably returned, I want to say something like 40 or 50 times, probably a little bit higher, the investment on that side. But really, I think we've been able to scale this business, really taking that same energy from the early stage of the company and then building it over time. So after 2014. When we raised our first round, we moved the company from Silicon Valley to Washington, D.C., where all of us actually went to high school and grew up, and just aggressively started scaling the company from there, right? So, we grew the company from 3 guys on a laptop to 5 to 10 to 50 to 100 to 500 plus employees, raising. In the process, we've raised about 230 million in venture capital, from everyone from the Mark Cuban and Jerry Yangs of the world to now Temasek, Apollo, S&P Global, The Economist, SoftBank, straight down the line, who really supported the business at each stage of the process. But I would say that the business, unlike many other businesses, the unique thing about our business is that we've actually never changed our business model. So from the very, very beginning of the company, when we were sitting down and building our business plan, to almost 10 years later, we've never ever changed our business plan. We still are collecting legal data. We're still selling it to law firms and companies. We're still processing the information. I would say that the only difference now is we have maybe slightly bigger ambitions, but nothing fundamentally I think has changed from when we were literally just three college kids trying to build a company.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And along the way, we've also noticed that you've also transitioned a little bit into Korea as well in terms of some of the acquisitions you made here and some of the business ventures you've had. Maybe you could talk about, since we're in South Korea, maybe you talk about some of your ventures in South Korea.
Yeah. So we have three main offices here in Asia. We have Seoul, Gurgaon, India, and Hong Kong very recently. We are looking into opening up Singapore and Sydney fairly soon, I would say in the next six to 9 months. Korea is the hub of our Asia operations. We funnel a lot of our finance, legal, accounting kind of structures essentially through the Korean market, even though I guess our by people, our India office is significantly larger. Why, you ask? Well, part of that is because I'm Korean. So we can kind of define what we want to do in the company.
Yep.
But I think Korea has this really interesting nexus of very smart people, high levels of R&D investment, very stable political structures, relatively stable political structures that essentially enable continued and sustained investment into the market. The primary business and operation was something that we started probably about a little less than a year ago. It's a company called Data Hunt. It's a subsidiary business.
Sure.
And one of the things that we're doing at our company now is actually spinning out our core technologies at FiscalNote into separate horizontal technology companies. So the same technologies that we talked about in terms of the application of AI, so the text processing, classification, summarization, data labeling, categories, all these different things, we're now starting to spin out into separate subsidiaries to actually start selling that technology, not just to our legal customers, but to healthcare, e-commerce, oil and gas, telecom, financial services, straight down the line. And so Data Hunt is our first experience with this. We spun out our data labeling and text processing technologies into a separate subsidiary a couple of months ago. That business actually is doing surprisingly well. We probably have about a dozen or so enterprise customers already in the first year. And we expect that number will hopefully triple or quadruple over the course of the next couple of months or so. We're now making investments, I would say, in robotic process automation, as well as in image annotation, in computer vision capabilities that effectively will be spreading each of these offices across Korea, as well as the US and whatnot. But Korea is the hub for our Data Hunt investment.
Sure.
And secondarily, we are planning on essentially investing into the Korean market as a hub for servicing the Japanese market as well. So our hope is to essentially start building out sales, marketing, and then design capabilities in the Korea office to be able to support both the Korean market and the Japanese market.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing your plans. So since we're talking about big data and we're supposed to talk about patent strategy as well, and as an attorney working with startups, oftentimes they don't fully appreciate the importance or significance of patents until they have a competitor come into the space or they get sued. And I know we talked about this and how you came to appreciate patents, and that became some of the core strategy behind FiscalNote as well. So maybe you could talk about how you came to grow the FiscalNote's patent portfolio and where you're going with the portfolio now.
Yeah, we started filing our first patents probably around Series A, Series B is really when we started to, because I think we understood that it would take several years in the US patent system to be able to start getting some of these licenses. But we understood inherently that building the IP portfolio for the business was fundamental, for our business. And unlike the content space, I guess, where everything is fairly copyable, I guess.
Sure.
We live in sort of hard tech, and within hard tech, the ability to be able to have strategic legal defenses especially as you get larger,
Sure.
we felt was extremely important to be able to build up that portfolio over time. And so the other thing that I would mention is that a patent is only as useful as its ability to be enforced.
Sure.
And so as we think about our own business, as we get larger, as we acquire other businesses,
Sure.
as we fend off early stage competitors that are coming into our market, I think increasingly we feel that the patent investment that we made very early on in our business is actually paying off now because we can actually start to either enforce our patents
Sure.
or have the defensibility of enforcing those patents in the future. And then secondarily, I think as we think about licensing our technology
Sure.
into these horizontal businesses, that's only possible by the fact that we have the technology that we own, and then B, the ability and the opportunity to be able to license that technology into
Sure.
subsidiaries or into other companies as well. So I think without that initial investment, it would have been very difficult to, for instance, if we were building off open source technologies, or if we had not spent the time to be able to protect our intellectual property, it'd be very difficult to look at these second, third, fourth stages of growth
Sure.
beyond our core business today. So it is, I would say, particularly important for us to continue to build that portfolio, either through strategic acquisition of companies and assets, or through just continuously working with our legal office and our counsel, essentially, to continue to file those patents.
Sure. And I think you chose a great timeline, because a lot of times companies either file too early when they're not fully ready, or the technology is not prepared, or too late when they should have filed some time ago. So I think Series A stage, when you have the funds and you have the technology more mapped out, is a great time period to start building the portfolio. And you have a great insight to do that. So I guess the lesson is for a lot of startup founders out there, if you have important IP, to try to protect it early on, rather than wait too late and lose the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially, I would say that, I wouldn't say that, it really depends on the business, right? But I think the harder the business is from a technological perspective, you've spent millions and millions of dollars developing your technology, especially if you're in things like artificial intelligence, but even there are fields that are more significant than that, right? So biotech, hardware technologies, it doesn't make sense not to protect that the millions of dollars of investment that people have made. But even if you're, I would say, in soft IP businesses like content or whatnot, those businesses do require strategic protection, especially in our media businesses, right? Because in our media businesses, we have a growing portion of our business that is increasingly built around licensing of the content, or distribution of information and news and the like. And so in order to have the legal right to be able to distribute that content, we essentially have to make sure that we build a defensive wall around it, so that the barriers to entry continue to go up.
Yeah, and I could tell that you're well versed in IP, because the terms like soft IP are the terms that only patent attorneys and IP attorneys use. So that's great. So I think what we're going to talk about is, we already touched on some of your future plans for FiscalNote, but to the extent that you could share, some of the horizontal areas you're going into, or what your personal vision is for the company going forward, what you can share with the audience that might be interesting for us to hear.
Yeah, our space is really interesting. Every year, about $170 billion are spent on companies buying data, right? So I'm sure everybody knows the companies in this category: S&P, FactSet, Morningstar, IHS, Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters. Each of these companies, many of them are, $5, $10, $15 billion a year in revenue, and we're still very, very small minnow in that space. So
getting there.
Yeah, we have a pathway to get to $1 billion in revenue. My goal is to try and get there as quickly and efficiently as possible. And part of the strategy, I think, is diversification of the data sets that we sell to our customers, right? So we built a great core business in the legal space with great technologies. The idea is actually to start leveraging that technology in two ways. The first we heard about already, which is horizontal application of our technology. So we are now entering the computer vision, machine learning, text processing businesses fairly quickly. But the second actually is to get to a point where we actually leverage those technologies in other vertical areas. So we are building vertical businesses in specifically in healthcare, in oil and gas, in construction and real estate. Essentially, start selling data to each of those sectors, whether it's property data, whether it's pricing data of drugs and pharmaceuticals, whether it's land rights and titles and deeds of individual exploration for oil and gas companies.
Sure.
We're essentially building new businesses on a constant and ongoing basis. I've told our internal teams next year that the goal is to launch up to 20 new businesses in vertical markets to start going after each of these categories. And to really keep innovating the business to get to a point where we're a diversified information business over time. So beyond that, obviously in our core legal market, we are right now not even maybe a third of the way through the entire globe in terms of collecting legal information. So we're still working our way through Latin America, through Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, where we're collecting more and more legal information. So my target is to essentially have every law and every regulation in every country on the planet collected, structured, digitized, and available for our customers in a global legal data business. And so that core business continues to grow. I think we're adding a new country every 2 to 4 weeks. And basically the hope is that over the course of the next couple of years, we'll continue to solidify our global position as the market leader in the legal data industry.
It's amazing. What are some of the challenges you face as you're going to, I'm sure not every country is going to open up their books to you in terms of providing you relevant data that you need. So you talk about some of the challenges you face and how you overcame that as you dealt with governments of the world, whether it's our government in the US or Korean government.
Yeah, well, I think the Korean government is actually quite good relative to relative to the rest of the world. I spent some time last year before COVID in Dubai, in Riyadh, in Jordan, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, where it's actually significantly more difficult to collect legal information out of those markets. So we have quite a large number of people basically kind of working directly with government in some of those markets. So we have close relationships with the World Economic Forum in Davos, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, essentially on creating government standards, digital standards for publishing laws, statutes, regulations. We're involved in many of the working groups, essentially to publish those information sets for our customers. But I concede the point that it'll be very difficult to get information out of South Sudan, out of Congo,
North Korea,
and North Korea. Although I don't think that we're not going to stop trying, right? If it's not the core legislative or regulatory information, we'll most likely collect news information, articles, which are publicly available for many for the world.
Sure.
I would say though that the biggest challenge for our business is not necessarily technical or product oriented; it's people oriented. And this is one of the things that I feel as a technology founder is that as you get bigger as a company, particularly as you get beyond 500 or 1,000 employees, the momentum for innovation slows down a lot. And the ability to create new products, the ability to launch new markets, the ability to go after new geographies, new customer segments, that risk tolerance shrinks quite a bit because a business has an existing business that needs to defend against competitors. People have day jobs. They essentially need to keep doing their jobs around. And so proportionally, when the company is 3 people, 100% of the company is focused on innovation, right? And then, as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, that proportion shrinks. And then when you get to 500 or 1,000 people, the the proportion of people working on innovative new products actually shrinks down to, 20%, 15%, 10%, 5%. And then the natural rate of innovation for the business slows down. So I think that the biggest challenge that we have as a company is pushing the wheel of momentum of innovation on an ongoing basis, and be able to continue to stay relevant for our customers. And for me, I would say that that comes down to our people and how our people are compensated, how they're incentivized, how they're structured and organized, the types of people that we hire. I'm making a very big push right now for the next 100, 200 employees in our company to be extremely innovative, to be kind of founders in waiting is what I call them. So basically people that can be founders, can be entrepreneurial, but want to have a little bit more of a structured environment. So that's the type of culture that we're trying to build within our company over time.
So since you touched on this fact a little bit earlier, touched on this that Korea has become a sort of hub for you because of some of the talent here and some of the other factors, but also something that goes into consideration is your background as a Korean American. This is hosted by Korea Society, and we're here in Seoul. And I promise you I was going to ask you questions like this. But what does it mean to be a successful Korean American founder, and how do you identify yourself, and how do you place yourself as a Korean American entrepreneur and in the space that you're in now?
Well, I think that first of all, I don't think that we're successful yet. We have a long way to go. It's especially when you're coming from the U.S. I would say that we're probably still considered a small business. So we're still working our way up. But I think that there are really interesting lessons that I've learned. I talk about this publicly with some of our employees and stuff. The U.S. right now is going through some really interesting times. It's going through, I would say, a diversity revolution. So particularly because of the political movements over the last couple of months, in particular, around Black Lives Matter and the kind of racial protests and the like. Many companies are trying to evaluate the diversity of their workforces, diversity of their management teams, and what it means for the strengths of their business. So what I basically said from the very beginning is that diversity is a strength, especially for a business like ours that needs to be global, that needs to have good understanding of different languages and cultures and political structures. Diversity is a core fundamental strength for a business, right? So not to bad talk our competitors or whatnot, but many of our competitors, which are much larger than us, may have thousands or tens of thousands of employees. That the management teams or the executive teams are all Caucasian male 50s, right? And they have no understanding of international markets, no diversity in their workforce or management teams. And it's very difficult for them to actually understand why certain countries operate a certain way, or why certain cultures operate a certain way. And so I think that as we built our management team, it's very diverse, both by gender and by racial aspects. And that's enabled us to essentially draw upon a wide variety of experiences to be able to build the international global business that we have. So at a personal level, what I would personally say is that, when I was in high school, I definitely felt that being Asian American, being Korean American, I thought was a disadvantage in the market, right? So, you're in the minority of the minority, right? And there's certainly a lot of discrimination. There's especially if you're living on the East Coast, it's very challenging to break into certain markets, particularly like the legal market, where, as you know, the core legal market in the U.S. is extremely non-diverse. And so there are times when I still feel that way. After we bought CQ Roll Call, for instance, I told the story to some people, but I was at a dinner in Washington, D.C., and this was with all of the owners of media properties in D.C., and probably about 100 people. I walk in, and I was the only Asian American in the entire room. And it's very difficult when you're almost singled out like that. But that's just part of being in the United States and operating just in the U.S. is that you have to be comfortable with that.
Sure.
But I think increasingly what I find is that as we globalize our business,
Sure.
the fundamental ties that I have to Korea, to
Sure.
Asia in general, are a huge strength. And we were able to enter the Asian markets much faster than our competitors.
Sure.
We're able to develop much stronger relationships, better investment relationships, better partnerships, distribution agreements, up and down from Korea all the way down to Indonesia. Largely because I think we're able to leverage the relationships that we had in Korea specifically to be able to expand our business. And so I think that's been a fundamental strength for myself. My two other co-founders are also Asian American. One is Chinese American, the other is Taiwanese American. And
Sure.
we've been able to leverage their core family markets essentially
Sure.
to expand our businesses very quickly and rapidly in Asia, much faster than our competitors.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I when we talked about asking that question, I know we joked about it, but that was a much better answer than I think both of us expected. Great. So I think we have some time left for live question from the audience here. So for those of you who are listening at home or at work, we're going to essentially take questions from some of our live audience here. And if they ask in Korean, I'll translate into English and Tim can answer in English. So if anyone has any questions here, don't be shy. 뭐 질문 있으시면, yeah, please.
This lady here.
Yeah.
I appreciate your
Yeah.
speech, and my question is, I understand that you're trying to expand your business to Korea, Asian countries. So, how can you overcome the language limitation to access the English? You provide English-based service. So all regulations and all the statutes in Korea are provided in Korean.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
do you have any idea to
Right.
translate efficiently from Korean to
Right.
English?
So for those of you who are listening at home, the question was a great question, I think, was how do you effectively deal with countries where if you're providing your access to your platform in English, how are you dealing with countries that don't use English, like South Korea?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's a great question because so let me start it from a technical perspective. Machine translation is a very difficult problem in general. There's different approaches to it that are successful to different and varying degrees. I would say that on the spectrum of translation of documents, and this is of course, no offense to lawyers, but I would say that legal document translation is probably the easiest. And the reason why is because the language is so technical compared to, let's say, a Harry Potter novel. The Harry Potter novel is extremely difficult to translate. There's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of entendres. There's a lot of context behind the words,
Sure.
right? So there's, if there's a plot, for instance, that needs to get translated and there are references back to that plot. The legal and then to a lesser extent, scientific languages are extremely technical, right? So human rights are translated as human rights in German, in Korean, in Spanish, at the United Nations, at the World Trade Organization, at the IMF. They're already translated multiple times by professional translators. There's the same thing goes for scientific as well, right? So, the concept of a liver is a tangible concept that can translate between a scientific English or Latin term to a Korean term to a Mandarin term, and then even the references in legal languages, there's technical languages or technical language essentially to reference back, right? So it could be, a section, subsection, subsection, that references back, or specific case law that refers to a specific case on a certain year, maybe even a specific document on a specific docket. What that means is that the translation is actually significantly easier. So how we've approached it essentially is by piggybacking off of existing international legal corpus of data. So this is off of international conventions out of Geneva, information out of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, basically existing international institutions that have already translated legal documents into several dozen languages. And then we build our own machine translation on top of that to be able to effectively translate those documents. Now, it's never going to be perfect. And I don't think that, there was always going to be challenges, but typically I would say that, let's say a topic like venue and jurisdiction, right? Venue and jurisdiction, very, very tangible legal concept that can get translated into multiple different languages. There's no ambiguity about what that exactly refers to in terms of a contract or the like. So, and then the last thing I would mention is the actual user experience. So from a user experience perspective, most of our users are extremely well versed in English, and that's largely because we sell to ExxonMobil, to Amazon, to whatever, and so their legal teams, I would say, are fairly global already. And what that essentially means is that if it's very rare where we sell to a Japanese company where not a single person in that legal department doesn't speak any English. And that's largely because of the customer segment that we've gone after. So over time, obviously, I think we'll have to continue to service smaller and smaller businesses as we get larger. But our core market right now is Global Fortune 2000 and the legal departments in that Global Fortune 2000. In many cases, we actually haven't gotten a lot of requests from our clients to get domestic in-language translation because they'd rather just have English or just the domestic documents themselves. So if you're servicing Japanese court cases, for instance, that means 9 times out of 10 that the company's already operating in Japan. They already have in-house counsel and outside counsel servicing that company or the subsidiary in Japan. And so there isn't a super high need to essentially translate Japanese and Spanish, for instance, right? So and that's partially how we've been able to keep a lot of our processing costs down in order to really make sure that we're building specific products for our customers.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Chimichi Park. I'm CEO at Bearverse, which is a bio startup providing a platform for new job development. And it is very interesting and impressive that you targeted your client market starting the legal industry, where it's one of the most conservative industry, as much as the clinical and then bio industry. So I have 2 questions. Number one is, did you guys have any legal counsel or legal advisory, one of your employees from the starting? And then next question is, would you share your experience in working on clinical data or clinical industry or future plan?
Okay. So for those in the audience on the webinar, the first question was because you're going after the legal market, which is a conservative market to start. So did you have a legal counsel as an advisor or as a team member from the beginning? And the second part was because the audience member works in the biotech industry, are you currently involved in any clinical testing in the biotech space? Yeah.
Yeah. So let me start from the second question first. So the number one market that we operate in is healthcare and pharma. It's actually it's about a quarter of our business. So it is the most heavily regulated market. It is the market that has the most significant demand for legal and regulatory information. I would say every major pharma manufacturer, as well as health insurance company, is a customer of ours in the United States. What's interesting actually for us is that I was just saying this to our employees maybe a couple weeks ago. We actually service the entire spectrum of the entire industry. So FDA, CDC, Center for Medicaid and Medicaid Services, Medicare Services, Johnson & Johnson, 3M, all within the cycle of regulatory, manufacturing, research and development, and distribution are all of our customers. And so our goal actually in the healthcare and clinical space is to actually go much deeper into the healthcare and pharma space over time. I don't think that we'll ever launch any drugs of our own. I don't think we're going to enter that side of the business, but all of the ancillary businesses associated with that, for instance, around regulatory compliance, dealing with FDA regulators around the world, market access issues, distribution issues, patent and IP related issues. We're essentially planning on building information businesses in each of those categories. Even when it comes to, for instance, marketing, pricing, manufacturing of individual drugs and products. We just launched a product about 2 years ago. In the US, drugs are not only regulated by the FDA, but they're also regulated at the state level by pharmacy boards, in some cases by local pharmacy boards as well, that regulate, for instance, the price, the time, the amount that can be sold at specific jurisdictions. And so we actually built a product specifically helping companies in that category with market access issues. That's a business that we are continuing to grow and scale on our side of the house. In the first question, the legal industry, I would say, is very conservative for sure. But I see that actually more as an opportunity, because once you're in, the barriers to entry and the defensive capability to stay lodged in as a key vendor is very, very high. Unlike other categories and software categories, I don't see dozens of competitors popping up in our space all the time, right? It's usually one or two competitors that we see kind of coming up here and there. We can monitor all of them on a pretty close basis. But the ones that do have breakout velocity in our category actually are extremely successful. And so we spent a lot of time building core relationships, with the Bank of Americas and the Facebooks and the Skadens and and the Perkins and whatnots of the world, basically trying to build core customer relationships that we can scale over time. I'd say the second thing is in the early stages, I obviously had a political background, so building or writing legislation and looking at statutes actually wasn't that difficult. But we did build, I would say, a pretty extensive advisory board in our company. So we brought on folks like Alec Ross, who is a secretary of Hillary Clinton's chief innovation officer, the State Department. We brought on Chris Lu, who I'd worked with, who was Senator Obama's chief of staff. We brought on Glenn Hubbard, who was President Bush's chief economic advisor. So basic folks that I had basically in my network to kind of help and support the business in a variety of different contexts. And so getting into most of the law firms actually wasn't super difficult. So it wasn't difficult to get into, White & Case or, to Kirkland or whatever. The bigger issue was getting the product right and making sure that the product was exactly what our customers needed. And the reality is that for most lawyers, LexisNexis and Westlaw are extremely bad products. They haven't innovated.
I'll say one's better than the other, but I'm
Yeah.
not gonna say which one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, but a lot of that is because the market has gone so fat, right? Because there's no startups, because there's no innovation. Lexis and West, each of them do almost $4 billion a year in revenues. Each of them do approximately $1 billion plus or so in free cash flow. They've been doing that for over 15, 20 years. And that's a recipe for disruption, right? When R&D investment goes straight to zero and people are pumping cash flow out of products, that's a recipe for startups to come in and start innovating, because customer expectations are going to change, right? They're going to change with mobile devices, with artificial intelligence, with new workflow capabilities. And when the incumbents don't shift with the customer changing tastes and expectations, that's the fundamental shift that we have in the software space to be able to go after that market. I'll end with this. the biggest movement in our sector was 2008, 2009, because what happened was companies started realizing that they were spending way too much with outside counsel, and they started shifting the resources to in-house. And you see this actually in all the major banks, in the insurance companies, in energy companies, where the share of legal spend that goes to outside counsel has shrunk dramatically. And JP Morgan now has more lawyers than dentists, right? Like they basically have, Google is the world's largest law firm. So that means that all of the existing tools and markets that used to exist in the law firm space fundamentally shifted. And now all these lawyers that are coming into the market, 2010, 2011, 2012, were entering into the corporate market, which have drastically different expectations, right? So they have significant more expectations around software, around workflow, around collaboration, around analytics, which are very different from billing clients on an hourly basis. And that's enabled us to essentially open up a market opportunity and build a specific product for that customer segment, expand from there.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, or maybe we'll make it, if it's a quick question, we'll make it two. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts, Tim. You mentioned the application of AI and big data into some of the most heavily regulated industries, the legal side and the healthcare side. I come from an investment background, so what other areas do you see emerging that you think there are still a lot of opportunities, the application of AI and analyzing big data?
So the question was, what other fields might be available that you are looking at or you might be looking in the future, aside from the legal and healthcare that you mentioned?
Well, I think that the biggest area that, so stepping back, in the early 2010s, the primary application of artificial intelligence was around analytics, right? So people would essentially look at, how do we visualize something better? How do we look at something better? How do we derive new insights as a result of artificial intelligence? I think that has shifted fundamentally in the last 2 or 3 years to automation, right? So automation as a driver for cost savings, efficiency, whatever the case is. Actually, in Korea is actually, I know people think that Korea is very behind in terms of artificial intelligence, but actually in this particular application, I would say that Korea is probably about pace, maybe slightly ahead of pace in terms of looking at automation opportunities. I would view it actually more almost like from a private equity angle, right? Where you have an existing industry where there's some amount of margin that can be automated, using computer vision or using text processing or classification or summarization. And those workflows can be automated essentially using robotic process automation or machine learning or whatever the case is. And actually in our sector, we compete against Lexis and West and whatnot. These companies actually have 20,000, 30,000 employees to actually collect information and summarize it. So our argument to the market actually has been that that our industry operates at 55, 60% gross margin. Our business operates at 80, 85%. Why? Because we were able to automate the biggest chunk of our operating expense using algorithms. So if I were an investment professional, and this is how we think about our M&A transactions, for instance, is we acquire business, we underwrite around automation, and then we essentially look at the cost savings and synergies associated with artificial intelligence. And the other way is which companies have potential for earnings growth, primarily based off of those automated capabilities that they're investing into their organizations.
So I think that just wraps up the time. But thank you again for having us, and it was a pleasure speaking with the team. Thanks so much for making time, and I'm glad that we're able to do it in person, live in Korea, with some semblance of normalcy with live audience here. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.